Hey folks, this is Riker with a gaming news wrap-up video where we discuss the happenings of the week. This week's topics include a roundup of Warhammer 40k video game news, CD Projekt Red refusing to admit Cyberpunk sales figures, a man losing in court to Nintendo to the tune of $2.1 million, and more. As always, discussion timestamps can be found in the video description below, but right before you skip ahead, just a quick reminder to ring that sub notification bell to be alerted to new Saturday episodes and stay up to date with gaming news highlights. Now before we move on, just a quick word from this video's sponsor, Squarespace. I built my website Riker.com using Squarespace, and I was able to do everything myself quickly and easily and with zero education in the field. All thanks to how easy Squarespace is to work with. Here I am updating my Diablo 4 page. Watch how easily I can add another section to the page with a link to my interview video, and then update the page's table of contents to include a link to this new section. All in about 3 minutes of work. Most of it was handled with nothing but a few intuitive clicks, and for the more complicated stuff, I was a quick Google search away from an easy answer. I've never had an easier time making a professional looking website. Basically, if you want to build a website, I recommend Squarespace. And Squarespace is currently offering my viewers 10% off your first purchase with them. Just go to squarespace.com/Riker or click the link in the description to sign up and start building your online presence. That's squarespace.com/RHYKKER and use code Riker to get started today. Let's kick things off with some rapid fire news. First off, we got a gameplay reveal trailer for Far Cry 6. The game is looking to be a solid entry in the series, delivering more of what fans love, and probably featuring the best antagonist of the series, given he's played by Giancarlo Esposito. All links, as usual, can be found in the video description. Next, we got a trailer for No Man's Sky Update 3.1, titled Prisms, which is a visual overhaul patch that adds a ton of graphics improvements. The highly anticipated survival game launched in 2016 to mixed critic reviews and a generally negative reaction from the player base, with Steam reviews coming in at mostly negative. It's one of the video game industry's greatest examples of an overhyped game that failed to deliver. However, it's also possibly the best example of a game that has made a comeback from a terrible launch. The devs have, for the past 5 years, continuously worked on improving the game and trying to make the game all that it was promised to be. Today's Steam reviews for the game are very positive, which has brought the overall average review from mostly negative to mixed. Here's to hoping that one day they can make it into mostly positive. In other news, we saw this week the reveal of a new game, Palia, a massively multiplayer community simulation game set in a fantasy world. The game will have elements of open-world adventure games, and players will be able to build a home, befriend NPCs, explore, harvest resources, and Animal Crossing and Stardew Valley seem to be the biggest influences. Pre-alpha signups are currently available, and the pre-alpha should begin later this summer. In World of Warcraft news, The Burning Crusade launched for WoW Classic this week, and despite Blizzard suffering a DDoS attack during the launch, things went relatively smoothly. So, Classic players were robbed of the classic, nostalgic experience of the Burning Crusade launch woes. Shame, Blizzard. How dare you have a competent launch. In other news, the Crysis Remastered Trilogy has been announced. This will be a bundle featuring remasters of Crysis 1, 2, and 3, and will launch this autumn for PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch. Crytek said the games play even smoother on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S via backwards compatibility. I just hope that Crysis gets remastered for every new generation of tech so that we can continue to use it as a benchmark to, ask, but can it run Crysis? Onto some Cyberpunk 2077 news. CD Projekt Red had their Q1 financial results call this week, and it seems they're a little shy to talk about exact numbers when it comes to Cyberpunk sales. After the main presentation and during the Q&A portion, when asked about sales numbers for Cyberpunk 2077, CDPR replied, quote, "We usually communicate unit sales when we reach certain milestones, round numbers that we can announce. And this quarter, as usual, we presented revenues divided into segments. And within CD Projekt Red, we also guided how much of the revenue was generated by Cyberpunk, close to 60% of product sales revenues. And as I mentioned, most of those sales came from PC digital distribution channels." So basically, I'm not going to tell you how many copies we sold, but we do have to tell you how much revenue we made, and I'm telling you how much of that revenue came from Cyberpunk. Well, unsatisfied with that answer, the questioner pressed the matter, stating that when he crunches the numbers based on the figures CDPR provided and his own analyses, he estimates about 80,000 copies of Cyberpunk sold during the first 3 months of 2021 and asked if he was in the right ballpark. Well, CDPR replied, quote, "I'm afraid this sort of calculation cannot be applied to CD Projekt." And they went on to explain how the revenues they report are revenue from their distributors, so if they sold a bunch of copies to a store in December 2020, then CDPR makes that revenue or reports that revenue in December 2020, even if some of those copies are still being sold today. Well, the questioner pressed the matter again by basically pointing out how CDPR literally just said that most sales were PC and digital and thus shouldn't be affected by brick and mortar store sales. But that part of the question was basically ignored. Besides, if the game was selling well, then the brick and mortar stores would be running out of stock and buying more stock, right? At the end of the day, no matter how you paint it, it doesn't look good. Cyberpunk had 8 million pre-orders and sold 13.7 million copies in just a few weeks in December 2020, which is great. But if by now it had reached 15 million sales, for instance, you think that would be the kind of milestone or round number that CDPR says they announce. Now, when you take CDPR's listed revenue from sales for the quarter, take 60% of that, which is what they say represents the Cyberpunk portion, then you get the equivalent of about $24 million US. If we do some very basic math, $60 a copy gives us about 400,000 copies of the game sold. Again, though, that's just some real simple math, doesn't factor in things like the cut that Steam makes, for instance, but it does put that number into perspective that the questioner, the analyst, put forth of 800,000 copies. It makes that 800,000 figure sound very reasonable. Now, when you consider that some analysts expected the game to hit 27 million units sold in its first year, seeing that it's unlikely that the game sold even 1 million units in the first quarter of this year, you can imagine that shareholders may not be thrilled. Profit for this quarter was less than half of what analysts expected. Now, of course, part of the reason for all this is the fact that to this day, Cyberpunk is still not relisted on the PlayStation Store. It was taken off that store way long ago, and we're now half a year post-launch, and the game still hasn't been fixed and updated enough to be relisted. CDPR did confirm that nearly half of the dev team is still working on the game, while smaller teams have moved on to pre-production of unannounced projects. Now, normally for this kind of game, only a small team would generally be left working on the game post-launch. Hell, even shortly leading up to launch, dev teams tend to start being spun down. You don't need the entire team still working on it. You need QA, for instance, but you don't need necessarily artists and a lot of other members of the team to keep actively developing the game. So you gotta credit CDPR for continuing to pour so much into Cyberpunk. And that takes us into Warhammer news. Games Workshop had an event this week in which they made a number of Warhammer video game announcements. Included in the announcements was a reveal of the Silence and the Fury for Total War Warhammer 2, which will be the game's final DLC. The Silence and the Fury reworks the Beastmen and releases July 14th. We also got the reveal of Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, and the promise of a full cinematic trailer for the game coming this August. While the game itself is set to release on PC in 2022. In Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, Grey Knights, the Emperor's Chosen, Citadel of Titan, the Chamber Militant, Ordo Malleus, the Demon Within, Eye of Terror, you get to lead a squad of Grey Knights on a galactic purge of demons. Warhunter 40k Chaos K Demon Hammers is a fast-paced, turn-based, squad-based tactical RPG with a story written by New York Times best-selling author Aaron Dembski-Bowden, who has published a ton of great 40k novels, including but not limited to Warhammer 40k Sagas of the Space Wolves, Warhammer 40k Voidstalker, Warhammer 40k Spear of the Emperor, Warhammer 40k Blood Reaver, Warhammer 40k Sabbath Crusade Arnagor, The Horus Heresy, A Rose Watered with Blood, Warhammer 40k, War for the Armageddon, The Magic School Bus, Warhammer 40k, Black Legion, The Horus Heresy, Path of Exile, Warhammer 40k, The Talented Mr. Ripley, The Horus Heresy, Lord of the Rings, and many, many more. So, high hopes for Chaos Gate Daemonhunters. Outside of that, we also saw the release of Necromunda Hired Gun, a fast-paced FPS in which you play a mercenary working jobs in Necromunda's criminal underworld. The game is getting mostly positive reviews on Steam, though on Metacritic, it has a 59 out of 100 critic review score and a 6.5 out of 10 user score. And lastly for Warhammer, GOG has a huge Warhammer game sale going on with discounts of up to 80% off various Warhammer games. In other news, a man decided to fight Nintendo in court, and now has a court order to pay Nintendo $2.1 million. I'm sure they'll see that money. For over a decade, Matthew Storman operated a website that hosted pirated copies of Nintendo games. In 2019, Nintendo filed a lawsuit against him for uploading and distributing pirated Nintendo games and profiting from mass-scale copyright infringement by charging paid subscriptions. Well, Storman contested the allegations and decided, in his infinite wisdom, to represent himself in court, as opposed to hire a legal professional to help him win a case against a multi-trillion-dollar company that has existed for over a century. In his defense, he said his website was not breaking any laws. Oh, okay. Oh, when you put it that way. Hey, wait a minute. You almost had me there. Ah yes, the classic, it's not illegal because I say it isn't defense. Arguing over whether a law should be a law always does well in court. Storman also stated that he didn't upload any of the pirated content himself anyway. Oh, whoa, I don't know how this stuff got here. I just own, operate, and profit off this website, but I'm not responsible for its content. And that just might have worked if he hadn't admitted in a previous deposition in 2019 to uploading pirated content to his website. I mean, it's an honest mistake. It's hard to keep your story straight when you're a lying scumbag. You know, it's the kind of mistake that you could have avoided if you hired a lawyer. Now, Nintendo requested more than $15 million in damages, but the judge only awarded that the defendant should pay $2.1 million. Hey, Nintendo, this guy can't even afford a lawyer. You can have his great-great-grandchildren paying off their life debt to you. And lastly, in some quick Diablo news, a new job posting has gone up for a senior character artist for Vicarious Visions for Diablo. Now, Vicarious Visions is the new Blizzard sub-studio that is making Diablo 2 Resurrected, but they are also being put on Diablo 4 now. Now, the job posting does not specify a game and mentions that the team is seeking an artist for the Diablo franchise. The job description involves creating characters, creatures, and weapons in the Diablo universe, and has as a requirement strong knowledge of medieval weapon and armor design. It overall feels more likely that this job posting is for D4 than D2R, given that D2R isn't too far off at this point. And in some very quick Diablo 3 news, it seems PTR for the next season is just around the corner. In a thread asking where the PTR patch notes are, community manager Filthy Rich wrote, "Working on the patch notes and should have something to share soon." In a separate thread, he also confirmed, quote, "Soon I'll be sharing news on the PTR front." And lastly, we got a heads up that we're going to have a Diablo 2 ladder reset on June 11th. And this is expected to be the final ladder reset before the launch of Diablo 2 Resurrected. Community manager Pez Radar stated, quote, "Please note that we will continue having ladder resets for Diablo 2 Classic in the future. Diablo 2 Resurrected will be on a separate cadence for ladder resets, and we will have more information on that as we get closer to launch." And that's going to wrap up this week's video. But do be sure to have checked out last week's video, in which we discuss how Blizzard sent a cease and desist to someone who cracked the Diablo 2 Resurrected alpha. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you like what you see on this channel and want to support the creation of more content, you can consider pledging on YouTube or Patreon and unlocking behind-the-scenes content, monthly virtual hangouts, and more. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Riker's Raiders for more gaming content.